It's good to have Dick Moss back with us. We're going to open our Bibles to Acts chapter 18. If we have any announcements, I'll hold those for the end, and Stephen will remind us of a few things. I thought about, we wrapped up Paul's time in Cortland. By the way, thanks to Jeannie for a really nice map here. So Paul has been here at Cortland.
Should have used permanent.
He kind of set up shop with Aquila and Priscilla, tent makers, all three of them. And then when some brethren came down with funds from Macedonia, Paul was able then to turn his attention full-time to preaching in the synagogue and preaching to the Gentiles as well. And I hesitate, I was going to jump right over into chapter 19, but I think we'll use tonight to kind of segue from one chapter to the next. And I don't know what to call this exactly. It's like a three-part parenthesis, but evidently Luke, the author of the book of Acts, felt that it was important enough to include because really, you see the way Acts 18 and verse 17 ends. Verse 18, Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And then that's, we want to pick up Paul in Ephesus, and that begins at chapter 19 and down around verse 1. So what we want to do is cover that material in between. So again, if we could start at verse 18. Paul, having remained many days longer, we don't know what is meant exactly by many days, but he lingered for a short while after Gallio's decision that he was not going to intervene in this squabble between the local Jews. So Paul stayed for a while, and then he put out to sea for Syria. Syria is actually all of this area right in here. And Paul's going to end up in Antioch. That's where he wants to get back to. But it says he put out to sea from Corinth to Syria, but he didn't go straight this way. He's wanting to go to Jerusalem. He crosses the Aegean, and that's the Adriatic. I always have to think about that. And he stops at Ephesus briefly, and then he continues down here to Caesarea. But his goal is really not Caesarea, it's to go to Jerusalem. And it really doesn't tell us anything about what this visit was necessarily concerning, but it ends up that they go down to Antioch, and they do say down to Antioch, even though it's headed north, because Jerusalem is that city set on a hill. So when we come to, it says, he put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. Somebody I studied after said they may have very well financed this excursion. But the first, I'm just calling these three different sidebars. And the first sidebar that we want to look at is, even before they left, it says, in Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. So Cenchrea is one of these seaports for Corinth. And so the way I'm understanding it, he had his hair cut because he had been keeping a vow. What's that about?
Mine says it marks the end of a vow.
Okay. Yeah, because let's all look at Numbers chapter 6. And let's read a few verses from Numbers. Most people seem to think this is what's often called a Nazirite vow. And here's what it says back in one of the books of Moses, Numbers chapter 6. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a woman or a man makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to dedicate himself to the Lord, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar, whether made from wine or strong drink. Neither shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh or dried grapes. All the days of his separation he shall not eat anything that is produced by the grapevine, from the seeds even to the skin." I don't know if it's a Nazirite vow, but this is what makes us think, verse 5. "All the days of his vow of separation, no razor shall pass over his head." That's why most think this was a Nazirite vow or some variation of it. And it very well may have been a vow of thanksgiving, a vow that Paul had taken earlier to say, "Lord, help things go well in Cortland." And they did turn out to be well. Some may have even sometimes the vow is not just looking back in thanksgiving, but in anticipation of God's blessings for a future journey. So he's getting ready, and he's going on a very, very important journey, although here Luke doesn't tell us a whole lot about his going to Jerusalem this time. I guess my question is, in Acts chapter 15, they had this big conference, you remember, and it was basically to make a decision. The elders and the apostles of the Jerusalem church needed to decide, with God being their guide, what was going to be their policy about Paul and his mission to the Gentiles. And one of the big issues, which really wasn't the only issue, but it was kind of like the tip of the iceberg, the zealot Jews, the real fastidious Jews, the real strong-minded Jews, were not about to let Gentiles come into the Israel spiritual things without making them keep the Torah. What do I mean when I say keep the Torah?
Circumcised. They wanted them circumcised.
In particular, that's what they were wanting, but as I said, that was just the tip of the iceberg. They really wanted the Gentiles to have to continue to follow the law. That's what we mean by the Torah. Torah is a word for the first 5 books of Moses. But they wanted to make the Gentiles have to come under the Old Testament law. And Paul argued that vehemently, saying that is not what God has revealed to me. That's not what I've been preaching. That's not what we preach. That's not what God revealed to Peter in the household of Cornelius. So they have this big conference, and it ends up going quite well. Peter really stands up and gives his testimony and says, you know, what Paul's saying is true because God revealed the same to me in the house of Cornelius. And James, the brother of the Lord, finally makes a statement that essentially says, whoever had gone up to Galatia to stir up the brethren there, they weren't really sent from us. They weren't our ambassadors. And basically the final decision is we're not going to bind the Torah on the Gentiles. They do not have to be circumcised. They don't have to come under the law. But as an expediency, I guess you could call it, they said we would like to ask the Gentiles to give up sexual immorality, to forsake that, to not practice that, to not practice eating blood offered to idols, and a couple other, but there's nothing sweeping there. In other words, they're saying, go ahead, Paul, you and Barnabas and Silas and whoever goes to the Gentiles, the law is not going to become binding. And I only bring all of that up to say now, after all that's been settled, what is Paul doing now keeping a Jewish vow? I thought, do you have to? It wasn't because he had to, was it? So we have to kind of peer into Paul's thinking here. And let's look at a passage that he wrote. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 9, just to deviate just a little bit, but with the idea of helping us grasp Paul's mindset. The decision from the Jerusalem Council was no, the law is not binding. But yet here Paul decides to take a Jewish vow. And it's the kind of vow where everybody knows you're doing it. You don't, that's not something you hide. Your way of life, if it's something like a Nazirite vow, the dietary restrictions and the hair issue. So, what is 1 Corinthians 9, 19, and 20? Would someone read that for us?
For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law.
So he's getting ready to continue on his Gentile mission, but everywhere he goes, as we followed him, he goes to the Jews first. So he's headed across the Aegean Sea to Ephesus, and as we'll see in a little bit, he's going to meet up with the Jewish community there. And do you think it's possible that Paul is using this vow-keeping to build a bridge, maybe back to the Jews? If some of them were feeling this guy has abandoned us, he's left us high and dry, and yet now Paul, he's not doing it because he has to. It's not mandatory. He's saying, when I go to the Jews, I try to be as Jewish as I can be. He's already thoroughly Jewish, but in his mind, he knows he doesn't have to practice those Jewish laws anymore because the gospel is free of that. That was a shadow to bring us to Christ, and once Christ arrived, those things were not necessary any longer. Comments? I saw Jeannie's hand and Stephen's, I think. Stephen, yours was first.
Yeah, at no point do we really, so Paul may have said, you know, I'm going to go to the Gentiles, but at no point does Paul ever say, I'm going to stop being, you know, does he say I'm going to stop practicing what I'm doing? And at some point when he's been arrested, they already says, you know, I was a Jew of all Jews pretty much. So even though he is not, even though he and no one else is obligated to keep doing these things anymore, he's going to keep doing that.
Stephen brings up a good point that's worth thinking about from a couple perspectives. And sometimes when we study about the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, we think, well, he made a conversion. We even call it that, the conversion of Saul, or conversion of Paul. And there is a conversion that's going on, but would it be true to say that Paul went from being a Jew to being a Christian? That's a trick question. Did Paul ever stop being a Jew? Everywhere Paul went, was he not preaching Jesus Christ as the Messiah of the Jews? And was he not upholding those words of Jesus where Jesus said, salvation is of the Jews? So Paul never stopped being a Jew. He was going all over the place, introducing the Gentiles to Jehovah God, the God of the Jews. But he was opening up the new and living way, which we often refer to as the new covenant. And that was breaking down barriers. And it was inviting people from every stripe and color and nationality and race to come and be in one big family of God. that God no longer, and that this is what the prophets said would happen. This is what was predicted. Everywhere Paul goes, he argues from the scriptures, saying this is what God said would happen. We didn't see it coming, and our thoughts about the Messiah were mistaken because we were having a hard time comprehending how could our mighty Messiah, who was supposed to come and put down Rome and put us back on the throne, like in the glory days of King David, how could it be that that Messiah was crucified on a tree? How the Jews are saying then, how could he be the Messiah? They couldn't see the mystery of the gospel, that Jesus' atoning death on the cross would open the floodgates of salvation to everybody, and that's how the conquest would come. It wasn't going to be a world dominion in the sense of generals and armies and palaces and all that. It was going to be a conquest of the hearts and minds. Jeannie, your comment?
Well, this is kind of a simplistic comment, but it seems to me that he makes clear that he has a right not to follow the law because of Jesus, but he gives up that right in order to reach out to the Jews.
Yeah.
Which I think is a good lesson for us.
That's a great point. And we do see a difference. Some people accuse Paul here of being, he can't make up his mind. You know, on the one hand, he absolutely refuses to have Titus circumcised. But then when Timothy joins the party later on, Paul says, Timothy, we're going to have you circumcised because you're part Jew. And we're going to be going in among synagogues everywhere where we go. And we want to go in and tell them we're all part of the circumcision. I'm not explaining it as well as we need to grasp it. But the point there was Titus was not a Jew in any form or fashion, and Paul was not about to let somebody say, you have to circumcise him in order to bring him into a good standing with God. But Timothy was an expediency. He was of a mixed marriage. His mother was a Jew, his father was a Greek, and he had never been circumcised. But Paul determined that the most expedient thing here is for you to be circumcised so that when we go into the synagogues, they will extend to all of us the right hand of fellowship. Comments or questions there?
You know, you mentioned breaking down barriers and walls. You can't really break down a barrier with a sledgehammer. And Paul recognized that. He's breaking down those barriers with the Jews through love.
Yeah. That's a good way to say it. All right, let's finish this little section here. We're back now to Acts chapter 18. So after it tells about the vow, it says he came to Ephesus. They came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you again if God wills. And he set sail for Ephesus. Does anybody here tonight have the King James Version? Rob's not with us tonight. He usually reads from it. I think the King James Version maybe has this additional comment that's not in all of the ancient texts, but it is in some of them.
I got a different version now.
In verse 20, it says, some of the old translations say, I must at all costs keep the coming festival in Jerusalem. In other words, he has got to get to Jerusalem. It's so important that he be there. And the Passover he's talking about, or the festival he's talking about, is the
What's
Passover.
the citation again?
That's it's an addition to the text that's added sometimes to the end of verse 20. Acts 18. Acts 18 and verse 20. You might have a footnote. I do not. My New International doesn't say anything about
The
it.
New King James has it as part of
part of verse 21. Okay, so read 20 and 21 from your version.
This is from the New King James. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus.
Okay. So Paul, they wanted to stay, which tells us that they were evidently thrilled that he was there. And maybe the vow was a little good seal of approval that was breaking down some barrier. They wanted him to stay, but he said, I can't right now, I've got to go, but if the Lord wills, I'll be back to you. So, verse 22 ends up this little segment saying, when he landed at Caesarea, so he leaves from Corinth, goes to Ephesus, stays for just a little while. They beg him to stay. He says, no, I can't. He sails on to Caesarea. From Caesarea, it's not too far into Jerusalem. And this little segment just ends right there. It says, he went, when he landed at, verse 22, when he landed at Caesarea, you have to read it carefully or it's confusing. You might think that he greeted the church in Caesarea, but he went up and greeted the church. The going up is again language of going up to Jerusalem. And that's where he was headed initially anyway. So he went up and greeted the church, and then he went back to Antioch. Let's pause here for just another minute and ask a question now, and I'll just call this our second sidebar. What was so important about Antioch? And I might preface this by saying sometimes Bible study can be so confusing. For example, this is one of those cases. We just talked about Caesarea. There's actually two Caesareas. There's one here and somewhere up here, I think. And then Antioch. This is Antioch of Syria, or Syrian Antioch. This whole swoop of land is called Syria. But there's also an Antioch of Pisidia over here. But I'm asking about this Antioch. What was so significant about this Antioch? And I'll help you here. Think missionary journeys. They all three originated with the church in Antioch. That's a little bit surprising. I just imagine that if we were to have a Bible quiz, unannounced Bible quiz, and I asked all of the congregation, from where did the missionary journeys originate? Probably quite a few people would say Jerusalem.
These 8 people.
Huh?
These 8 people right here with that.
You know. Now, if we get a sneak quiz, you'll be ready for it.
There has to be a prize involved.
Yeah, so Antioch, what did you say?
Do you think they were well funded in Antioch? Do you think they?
That's a good question as to whether or not we don't get the idea that they sent them out with a bundle of funds.
Right.
Because
gave them enough to get going.
Well, there's something about them being, I'll tell you, I am reading a book right now by N.T. Wright it's a biography of Saul, and it is really fascinating. And this Antioch was such a mixed group of people. It was almost like what you might call an incubator or a greenhouse for, is this Christianity thing going to work? Is this missionary thing really going to work? Can we really it's kind of like the Roman Empire in a miniature form. So Antioch becomes the experiment, and it works in Antioch. It's thriving in Antioch. And it becomes the test case or the proving ground. So I'm using a lot of metaphors here. So the Antioch church says, if it can work here, it can work everywhere else. So we're going to send these men and send them out. So Paul and Barnabas go on the first journey. They go on, want to go on a second journey, but there's a little bit of disagreement. John Mark left him on the first. Barnabas is a son of encouragement. He wants to help John Mark get back on the horse, and he knows he's done wrong, and he wants to help him, but Paul says no. I'm not going to risk it. It's too dangerous out there. I don't want somebody that's going to turn on us again and abandon us. So Paul ends up going one way with Silvanus or Silas, and Barnabas takes Mark under his wing. Mark is his cousin, and nurtures him. Really, at this juncture, we don't hear, with the start of the second missionary journey, we don't hear any more about Barnabas. We hear later on, the very end of Paul's ministry, he talks about how Mark is very useful to him. So whatever Barnabas did to help rebuild Mark's self-esteem or Mark's faithfulness, it worked. But we don't hear any more about Barnabas. But Paul and Silas then begin to travel together. And so this third missionary journey begins in verse 23. It doesn't say where they're headed. It just says, having spent, well, it does give us a generic, having spent some time there at Antioch, he departed then and passed successively through the Galatian region and the Phrygian region, which would be up in here. And I've added, that would include churches that had been planted in Antioch of Pisidia, which was in here, and Iconium, and Lystra, and Derbe. So they're going back and retracing some of the churches that were established earlier to encourage them. And that's all it really says about that. Any comments on sidebar number 2?
Carrie, do they have the directions mixed up or something? Because mine says, then he landed in Caesarea, that's there. He went up and greeted the church, and then he went down.
Yeah.
Antioch's up.
I know, I mentioned that, Trudy, you might have been just reading something when I was saying that, but oftentimes everything goes down from Jerusalem. This is more a theological statement than it is a geographical. Yes, Antioch is up here. There is no Antioch south of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is the city that sits on a hill. And everything goes down from Jerusalem. And it's not just, it's not that it's such a high mountain that nothing else is higher than it. It's the idea of God's temple is in that holy city that's set on a hill, and all streams down from it.
It's elevated in status.
Yeah, elevated in status. That's a good way to say it. But it's good. Now, you see, Trudy, your observation there, and you've been in the church a good while, in my mentioning 2 Antiochs, one there, 2 Caesareas, one there, one up here, we who are older really have to come alongside and help some of those who are younger. Jeannie has spent a little time with Donna White, and I'm not trying to talk out of school here, and I think I would say this even if Nellie and Betty were here, but Nellie's been brought up under the King James Version, and she wants to tell Donna the King James that's the Bible that you need to be reading from. When Donna has some learning disabilities to start with. And when she tries to read the King James Version, it is extremely difficult. Now, if you love the King James and you're doing fine with it, you go right ahead. But sometimes we have to do whatever we can, not compromising truth, but trying to expedite the study of others and do whatever we can to help them. And sometimes we take for granted some things that new Christians, they don't understand to start with. And we just assume sometimes that they know all of this stuff. So one of the great things about Bible study is to have interaction like this, where somebody, even who's been in the church for a while, can comment and ask a question. And had Donna been here tonight, she would have said, I've been thinking that same thing, but I'm too afraid to ask.
Well, that NIV Reader's Version, she needs to get hold of that.
Well, she very well might have it. I think she's got some newer, and I think Fred has been a big help to her in her studies too, so.
I mean, that thing puts it in modern day.
Yeah.
She invests in Bible study tools that she thinks will help her. To her credit,
and
so.
she has a smartphone, and you can get a lot from that. All right, let's go to this third sidebar, if there's no other questions here. And if we get done a little early tonight, that's okay. You can maybe get back to the house and see if you've been egged. We're hoping, we haven't had any trick-or-treaters for several years, and we're hoping we didn't have any
We don't
tonight.
believe in that.
I have.
We haven't had any suggestion fields left.
Even our own grandkids, they say, well, Grandpa, you got candy all the time, we're not coming.
Y'all get a lot, Stephen?
Some years, yes, some years.
And Dick's, you guys get quite a few?
Maybe 1 or 2 a year.
Oh,
People are going to parties.
really? And John, you guys get many? No. Well, Vic, you get many?
Varies year to year, but I have a deaf girl handing out candy at my house right now. So I don't know how she's gonna hear a doorbell. It'll work something out.
What do you mean?
Anthony's,
Oh,
girlfriend.
Yeah, but he hid the Reese's peanut butter cups before he left.
I did, yeah. I hid the bag of Reese cups. Well,
maybe you should have left a sign that says "Shine the light" on the window or something. She could probably feel.
Well, she's gonna stand at the
Yeah.
door.
All right, the third sidebar, and it's just going to involve a few verses from 24 through 28. And then again, this is all kind of a parentheses between Paul leaving Corinth and then ending up getting on a third missionary journey, starting off in Ephesus. And it probably covers a span of about a year or so. Here's what we read in verse 24. A certain Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus. Now he's getting there, let's just assume, not too long after Paul leaves Corinth. So while Paul's away, Paul stops at Ephesus for just a little bit, but he says, I can't stay, but Lord willing, I'll come back later. In comes Apollos. And it says that he was mighty in the scriptures. And verse 25 continues, this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being only acquainted with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. All right, let's stop there because that's a mouthful. And this has been troubling to a lot of people who read this. First of all, a little biographical sketch. Alexandria, Egypt, was down here, right on the. It was probably one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. There was a library there that it got destroyed by fire, and what weeping and gnashing of teeth that caused among the world and scholars. In the year 200 BC, this is where a group of scholars met to translate the Old Testament Hebrew Bible into Greek, and we know it as the Pentateuch. I mean the Septuagint. The Pentateuch is the same as the Torah, the first 5 books. But the Pentateuch, the Septuagint, is the Old Testament Hebrew translated into Greek so all the Greek world could read the Old Testament. There was a fellow that also was really prominent in Alexandria by the name of Philo. He was brilliant, and he really tried to build bridges among the Greeks, between the Old Testament and the Greek people, and he really popularized the idea of allegories. I'm not going to go into any more than to say that. But we know that Apollos was from down here. Let's think of everything we know about him here just for a little bit. He's a Jew. It starts off, we know he's from Alexandria. And it says that he was, how does it say it? Was an eloquent man. Verse 24. A certain Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man. What does that mean?
I look at that as someone that can speak well
Somebody that can
and be
speak
received
really
well.
Maybe be captivating in his speech to where people would just be drawn to listen to him.
NIV to me doesn't connote that. It says, but that's NIV. It says he was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures.
Well, this adds, maybe the eloquent part is tied in with some of their thoughts, but I've got seven subpoints. He was eloquent, according to my version in verse 24. Also, verse 24 says he was mighty in the scriptures. Mighty in the scriptures. What do you think of when if you hear somebody that's mighty in the scriptures?
They quote him, they know him.
He knows the book. He knows the book, inside and out, we might think.
I mean, this is the Old Testament.
Yeah,
stuff
right.
about.
But that's a little bit problematic because of what we're going to read to come here. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. What does that mean? He had been instructed, not in the Old Testament alone, but in the way of the Lord. But in verse 25 in mine says he was fervent in spirit. I don't know if that's a way of saying he was just full of a ball of energy or full of enthusiasm. But then verse 25 also says he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus. But here's the problem. Then it adds in verse 25, he was acquainted only with the baptism of John. And furthermore, it puts an exclamation point by saying he was speaking out boldly in the synagogues. All right, pick your hands up. What's the problem here?
Well, what I see is he knew the scriptures well. To be eloquent, he understands what he's reading. So he had to understand that Jesus was the Messiah. He'd probably seen that mystery that was there.
Okay.
And that kind of opened him up for that.
Yeah, and I think that's documented a little bit more when we look at the way verse 28 ends. The way it's going to end is he's going to say, hey, I'd like to go over to Corinth and preach. And the brethren in Ephesus said, do it. That'd be great. In fact, we'll send you a letter of recommendation, to go with you and let everybody know that you have our blessings. But look at the way it ends. He powerfully refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating by the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. But there's a fly in the ointment. And we find that fly in the ointment in the middle of verse 26. It says, all of 26 says, he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Now, that's a great lesson in and of itself, the way they handled this. This young couple that had been working with Paul, well, I don't know how young they were, Priscilla and Aquila, when they heard Apollos, They must have seen his heart, first of all. But then they heard him say some things that were not right. So rather than flag him and make a big stir in public, it says they took him aside, meaning privately, and showed him the way more accurately, rather than denounce him in public as a heretic or a false prophet or somebody that really didn't know what they were talking about. I don't know for sure. I think I have a hint of what the problem was, in that, did John preach baptism? Now, John the Baptist. Was John's baptism legitimate? Was it for the forgiveness of sins? Yes, it was. Indeed, it was. The Gospels tell us that. Was it, this is going to get harder and harder, so stay with me. Was the baptism of John, after Jesus died on the cross, could people take their choice?
No.
All right, so if this is after Jesus has died on the cross, and it is, because it's late in the book of Acts. But even though Apollos knows about Jesus, he knows the way of the Lord, he knows that Jesus is the Messiah. See, sometimes here we got the whole package and we say, well, he should have seen that. But somehow he hadn't put the connection together that you have to die with Christ Jesus. You have to be buried with Christ. So he's still preaching the baptism of John. That's all he's known. Maybe he was baptized under the baptism of John, and that was perfectly legitimate. We don't have any indication that any of the 12 apostles ever were rebaptized. They were baptized during the days of John, but we don't have any explanation or example of where on the day of Pentecost, when Peter preaches the first gospel sermon, there's no need for Peter and James and John to look at each other and say, well, maybe we ought to be rebaptized now that... No, they were taught truth and they were baptized, but after the crucifixion, you couldn't keep preaching John's baptism, because the death of Jesus on the cross superseded anything that John was teaching. So you don't keep teaching John's baptism after Jesus becomes the way of salvation. You understand that? It's a little bit confusing, but evidently that's what Apollos was doing. So you can just imagine Aquila and Priscilla pull him aside and say, Apollos, you're right, Jesus is the Messiah. And because he's the Messiah, we now die with Christ. And that's what baptism in Christ is all about. And baptism in Christ supersedes the baptism of John. Both of them led to forgiveness, but the baptism of Jesus, you can't go back to John's after the death of Jesus. Jeannie?
Well, I shouldn't go down this road, but were those that were baptized under John's baptism, were they baptized into the death of Jesus?
Well, the next chapter it says 12 of
They,
them.
they couldn't have been, because
Right.
Jesus hadn't died.
Exactly.
So they accepted what was being taught at that time, but it wasn't a baptism into the death of Jesus. You're asking, did they have to later on be rebaptized? Well, there have been whole debates about that.
Well,
We don't have any evidence. We have no evidence in the scriptures of the apostles ever being rebaptized.
well, quite frankly, I never thought of it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to get into chapter 19. 19 covers a lot of what you're talking
Yeah.
about. But you're going to get into that.
We're going to
next
get
week.
into that next week. So
If I got into it now, I'd be pulling a Burdette, so. He was always good for that.
It does get thorny in chapter 19, but it's already getting thorny here.
Pretty excited.
You know, it's just a little bit hard to say, okay, we could say you could be eloquent and be mistaken, but this says that he was mighty in scriptures. And if you're mistaken in something as serious as being baptized into Christ, I don't know how mighty in scriptures you are, but it says he was. And I'm only pointing this out to say that there's got to be a great measure of, sometimes we are so legalistic in our mindset. We think we've got everything figured out, and there was a lot of room here, a lot of margin for error. Because if this happened in some of our churches, this Apollos would have never had a chance. He would have been run out on a pole.
Publicly.
But you know, all this is, we're looking back at it.
Yeah,
We have to look at it from their perspective.
right.
They're still developing all this and learning all this. The Holy Spirit's still revealing stuff to them.
Yeah, and it gets even hairier because if I was Luke, I would have reworded this, but it says he was speaking and teaching accurately concerning the things of Jesus. And I would say, no, he wasn't. He didn't even know about the baptism into Jesus. How can you teach accurately the things of Jesus and not tell somebody that you have to be baptized into Christ?
He was accurate.
What?
To a point.
Yeah, to a point.
But how unusual was this man that he knew the Old Testament scriptures and applied them so well that he refuted the Jews and proved from scriptures that Jesus was the Christ when so many others just didn't get it.
Okay, we'll close on this note. I struggle with, there's that little phrase, does everybody have it in those verses somewhere where it says he was fervent in spirit?
Yeah.
What does yours say, Judy?
He taught with great fervor, or he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately.
Okay. That's often the way, that concept, that it's a small s, but what if it means that he was guided by the Spirit? But then you get into problems because you say, well, then he was guided wrong.
Well,
Or maybe it was piecemeal
mine
guidance.
said with fervor, or well, there's a footnote, with fervor in the Spirit.
In the Spirit.
Well, you know he was an astronomer too, with a name like Apollos.
Don't come confuse us anymore. All right, anybody else? All right, now, your assignment here is to read chapter 19 and take a bunch of notes and come ready to study this.
There's going to be a riot.
There is going to be a riot. Hopefully not here in this building. In Ephesus, we know there will be. All right, thank you very much. Nellie and Betty
Books are cold.
had another doctor's appointment today, and Mark said they called and they had just got home and they thought, they weren't sure yet if they were going to be here tonight, so I imagine they're worn out. Nellie and Betty, I don't know. Anybody know about Keith and Linda?
Trick or treating.
I kind of hate to erase that map.
Vic said I should have done it in permanent marker.
Turn it around.
Done it in permanent marker.
That boot of Sicily is, the boot of Italy, and geez, you got Sicily. We'll do
I'm finding a lot
that
of
for
errors.
Keith to see on Sunday.
I'm finding a lot of errors up there.
Where's the loan? Oh.
Cypress is not there, it's supposed to be.
I think you did a good job.
Yeah,
You too.
yeah, because I looked at the map in the back of mine, and it's like that.
Well, the thing that he gave me, the water wasn't shaded. He points out, he goes, well, the water dips, and I'm like, that's water!
She left out the Aegean Sea.
I took a history class in college, and it was secular professor and stuff. But she told us from the first day, she said, I'm putting Jerusalem on every single test until every single student gets it right, because that's how important that city was to ancient history. Okay, so, women's study tomorrow night, right? Okay. Monday, wow. Sorry, teaching stuff is getting in my head right now. Sunday,
Well, Saturday quilters.
yes,
Yeah.
quilters on Saturday, thank you for remembering that. Sunday, we do not have a cover dish luncheon that Sunday, and we are meeting that Sunday night. We will have our cover dish luncheon on the Sunday after that, on the 11th, and not have it Sunday night that night. So we're switching things, so things are a bit reversed around.
It's mainly a tie-in with the veterans.
Yes.
Just keep reminding us, because that's how
Yes.
folks get mixed up.
We're breaking a 20-plus year tradition, so it's gonna be a bit confusing.
Saturday night, we go back in time for.
Yes, that's right, the clocks go back on Saturday, so you get an extra hour to probably not sleep, because I don't think anyone actually sleeps.
The thing about, Elwood now, Gene, it's on.
Yes, I do, yeah.
Oh, good.
Do you know, I'll ask you after services, so, got a couple of things I want to know logistic wise, so, for that.
You're too young for that.
Not for staying here.
He's ahead of schedule.
Well, thank you, Chris. Put me up to pasture if that's the case. Anything else? Like anything to be there?
Yeah, I might be a little slow Sunday. I'm getting some teeth yanked out of my head tomorrow, so,
Okay.
for future implants.
Sounds fun.
So all I can eat is mush.
Baby food grinder, just take it,
Yeah.
chop it up and swallow it down. It works, trust me. Looks disgusting, it works. I knew this from experience.
Okay.
Birthday month.
Ask the cooks at camp about it. They remember. Okay, number 797, number 797. And then Mark, can you close us out afterwards? Thank you. Lord, we come before thee now, at thy feet we humbly bow. Oh, do not our suit disdain. Shall we seek thee, Lord, in vain? Shall we seek thee, Lord, in vain? Lord, on thee our souls depend. In compassion thou descend. Fill our hearts with thy rich grace. Turn our lips to sing thy praise. Tune our lips to sing thy praise. In thine own appointed way, now we seek thee, here we stay. Lord, we know not how to go, till a blessing thou bestow. Till a blessing thou bestow. Grant that all may seek and find thee, a God supremely kind. Heal the sick, the captive free. Let us all rejoice in thee. Let us all rejoice in thee.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we've had to come study your word. We hope we all gain some insight into your scripture, Lord. Please go with all the sick in our congregation and the sick of any family members or those in our congregation, Lord. We'd like to pray at this time for my daughter, Cindy Jean, as she's about to give birth to a granddaughter. Heavenly Father, we'd also like to pray for Rob, who's traveling. We'd like to pray for Nellie and Betty and all those that are in need of our prayers concerning their health. Go with us us as we go our separate ways. In His name we pray, amen. Yes, sir.
What's Judy do every time?
I think Sunday is the actual due date. So
Talking on it.
she feels like
Oh, never.
very firm. It's a girl, you know what?
I got 3 great grandkids.
Has 8